On the Giza Plateau, in the hour before the tour buses arrive, the Sphinx sits low against the sand the way it has for thousands of years, its face turned east toward the horizon where the light first breaks. People have been asking the same question about it for centuries. Who carved this thing and when? The textbook answer is short and confident. A pharaoh named Khafre, roughly 4,500 years ago, as part of his pyramid complex at Giza. For most of the 20th century, that was the end of the conversation. But there's a smaller, stranger debate that has been running quietly underneath that textbook answer for more than 30 years now, argued by actual geologists in actual peer-reviewed journals, and lately it's resurfaced in an unexpected place. People typing questions directly into AI chatbots like Grok and asking point-blank how old the Sphinx really is. What comes back isn't a secret revelation or a stunning new discovery. It's something almost more interesting than that, because it's a snapshot of a real scientific argument that has never actually been settled, laid out plainly by a system with no career on the line and no side to defend. So let's actually get into what that argument is, because it deserves better than being turned into a mystery box thumbnail. It starts with a geologist named Robert Schoch, who taught at Boston University and specialized in the physical weathering of rock. In 1990, Schoch traveled to Giza at the invitation of a writer named John Anthony West, who had spent years arguing, based mostly on intuition and the writings of an earlier scholar named René Schwaller de Lubbock's, that the Sphinx looked far older than its official age. West wasn't a geologist, so he wanted someone with actual credentials to look at the stone and tell him whether he was seeing things. Schoch was skeptical going in, but when he examined the walls of the pit that surrounds the Sphinx, the deep enclosure carved out of the bedrock to free the monument's body from the surrounding plateau, he noticed something that genuinely surprised him. The weathering on those walls didn't look like what wind and blown sand typically do to limestone. Wind erosion tends to be low, horizontal, and sharp-edged, cutting hardest near the ground where sand grains travel fastest. What Schoch saw instead were deep, rounded, vertical channels, a rolling, undulating pattern that runs from the top of the enclosure walls downward. That kind of erosion, he argued, is the signature of water sheeting down a rock face over a very long period of time, not a one-time flood, but sustained, repeated rainfall, the kind Egypt's modern desert climate simply doesn't produce anymore and hasn't produced in thousands of years. That observation is the entire foundation of everything that followed, so it's worth sitting with it directly rather than rushing past it. Schoch wasn't claiming to have found an ancient civilization or a hidden message. He was making a narrower, testable geological claim. This specific pattern of erosion, on this specific type of limestone, is more consistent with prolonged rainfall than with millennia of dry desert wind. And if that's true, then the Sphinx would need to have already existed as a carved monument during the last period when the Giza Plateau had that kind of climate, which climate scientists place in the range of roughly 7,000 to 5,000 BCE, and possibly extending back further into the tail end of the last ice age, sometime between 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, when North Africa was significantly wetter than it is today. Schoch published his findings and presented them at a Geological Society of America meeting in 1991 alongside seismic survey data he'd also collected. Using a technique called seismic refraction, which measures how shock waves travel through rock to estimate weathering depth beneath the surface, Schoch argued that the bedrock beneath the Sphinx enclosure showed significantly deeper weathering than the bedrock beneath structures at Giza that are confidently dated to Khafre's era, suggesting the Sphinx had simply been sitting there being weathered for a lot longer. Now, if the story stopped there, it would already be interesting. But real science doesn't just stop after one geologist makes a claim, and this is where the actual scientific community, not a caricature of stuffy gatekeepers but working geologists and Egyptologists, pushed back hard, with their own evidence rather than just their own authority. The most serious alternative explanation came from a geologist named K.L. Gorey, who published a competing analysis in 1995 arguing that the weathering pattern Schoch attributed to rainfall could actually be produced by something called salt crystallization exfoliation, a chemical weathering process where salt deposited in the porous limestone expands and contracts as humidity levels shift, gradually flaking the rock away in a rounded, undulating pattern that can look remarkably similar to water erosion without requiring a drop of rain to fall for thousands of years. This process, sometimes described as producing a kind of spherical weathering, attacks limestone hardest at its most exposed points and edges, which over time can round out sharp features into the same smooth, wave-like channels Schoch had photographed. If Gory's explanation is correct, the erosion pattern stops being reliable evidence of ancient rainfall at all, and the age question falls back to conventional archaeological evidence. And that conventional evidence is genuinely substantial, which is a point that often gets buried whenever this debate gets turned into video content. The Sphinx sits directly along the causeway connecting Khufu's pyramid to his valley temple, a temple built from massive limestone blocks quarried from the very pit that surrounds the Sphinx, meaning the quarrying operation that shaped the Sphinx's body and the construction of Khufu's temple complex appear to be part of the same continuous building project. The valley temple itself, faced in granite and built with construction techniques and tool marks consistent with Old Kingdom masonry practices, has never seriously been proposed as belonging to some separate, older civilization. There's also the practical problem that no material culture from the proposed earlier era has ever turned up at Giza. No tools, no settlement remains, no burials, nothing that would place organized, monument-building humans on that plateau 7 or 10,000 years before the pyramids, a period when, as far as the archaeological record for the entire region shows, human communities were small, mobile groups who had not yet developed the kind of large-scale stone construction the Sphinx would require. For a hypothesis that reshapes the timeline of civilization this dramatically, that absence of supporting material evidence is a serious problem, and it's the main reason the mainstream archaeological and geological community, while taking Schoch's erosion observations seriously enough to argue with them directly in journals for 3 decades, has not adopted his conclusions. There's also a detail about the Sphinx's head that gets wildly exaggerated whenever this topic goes viral, so it's worth explaining what's actually documented instead of what gets invented. It's true that the head of the Sphinx looks noticeably small relative to the scale of its body, and that observation isn't controversial or new. But the explanation Egyptologists give doesn't require inventing a hidden older lion head underneath. The head has been recarved and restored more than once across Egyptian history, most notably during restoration work in later dynasties, and the body's limestone is considerably softer and more prone to weathering than the harder stone typically used for the head, meaning the head has simply eroded differently and been repaired differently than the body over thousands of years of exposure and periodic royal restoration projects. One of the most famous pieces of evidence for the Sphinx's long history actually comes from between its paws. A granite slab known as the Dream Stele, erected during the reign of Thutmose IV around 1400 BCE, more than 1,000 years after Khufu. The inscription describes how the young prince fell asleep near the half-buried Sphinx, already sunk in sand and already considered ancient by that point, and dreamed that the Sphinx promised him the throne of Egypt if he cleared the sand away from its body. That stele is genuine, well documented, and widely accepted by mainstream Egyptology. It tells us that by 1400 BCE, the Sphinx was old enough and buried deep enough in sand to already feel like a mysterious relic to the Egyptians of that era, which fits comfortably within a roughly 1,000-year gap since Khufu's reign, without requiring any additional thousands of years to explain it. So where does that leave the actual scientific debate today, more than 3 decades after Schoch first raised it? It leaves it exactly where most genuinely unresolved geological arguments end up, unresolved, but not equally weighted. The water erosion hypothesis has never been disproven in the sense of someone definitively showing it's impossible, and Schoch himself has continued publishing and defending it, later revising his minimum estimate for the Sphinx's age even further back, into the range of roughly 9700 BCE, a date that lines up suggestively with Plato's account of Atlantis, which is part of why the theory gets pulled so often into conversations about lost advanced civilizations even though Schoch's own geological papers don't make that specific claim. Meanwhile, the archaeological case for a 4th dynasty origin under Khufu remains the position held by the overwhelming majority of Egyptologists and geologists who've examined the site, based on the causeway connection, the quarrying evidence, the absence of any earlier material culture, and competing chemical weathering explanations like Gory's that don't require abandoning everything else we know about when organized human civilization actually developed in that region. There's a broader climate history worth laying out here too, because it's the part of Schoch's argument that actually has the strongest independent scientific backing, even among researchers who reject his conclusions about the Sphinx specifically. The period Schoch points to, roughly 10,000 to 5,000 BCE, corresponds to what climate scientists call the African humid period, a well-documented stretch of the Holocene when the Sahara, including the region around Giza, received dramatically more rainfall than it does today. This isn't a fringe claim. It's supported by sediment cores, ancient lake beds, and rock art depicting savanna animals like giraffes and hippos found deep in what is now bone-dry desert, evidence that a genuinely different climate existed there within the time frame Schoch is describing. So the climatic backdrop Schoch needs for his hypothesis to work isn't in dispute among Earth scientists. What remains disputed is narrower and more specific. Whether the particular erosion pattern on the Sphinx enclosure actually requires that wetter climate to explain, or whether a different mechanism entirely, operating under Egypt's more recent dry climate, could produce a visually similar result. That's a genuinely technical rock weathering question, and it's the reason this argument has lasted as long as it has among specialists rather than being resolved in a single afternoon. It's also worth understanding why the Egyptological community pushed back on Schoch as forcefully as it did, because the resistance wasn't simply institutional defensiveness. Egyptologist Mark Lehner, who has spent decades mapping and excavating the Giza Plateau in extraordinary detail, was one of the most prominent voices arguing against Schoch's dating, and his objections were rooted in the same kind of physical, on-the-ground evidence Schoch himself relied on. Lehner's excavations traced the layout of a workers' village and bakeries near the pyramids, complete with pottery, tools, and organizational infrastructure consistent with a large, coordinated labor force operating during the Old Kingdom. The exact era conventional dating already assigns to the Sphinx's construction. If an entirely separate, far older civilization had carved the Sphinx thousands of years earlier, there's no corresponding settlement, no corresponding tool assemblage, and no corresponding administrative infrastructure anywhere on or near the plateau to account for it. Lehner's counterargument wasn't an appeal to authority. It was a direct challenge to go find the evidence for who these earlier builders were, where they lived, what tools they used, and what happened to all of it, a challenge that, more than 3 decades later, still hasn't been answered with any physical evidence Schoch or anyone else has produced. This is roughly the point where AI chatbots like Grok actually enter the story, and it's worth being precise about what they're doing when someone asks them this question, because it's not what a lot of viral thumbnails claim. When people have posted this exact question to Grok directly on social media, asking who built the Sphinx and how old it really is, the responses that have circulated are measured and balanced rather than sensational. Grok's own posted replies describe Schoch's water erosion hypothesis accurately, correctly attributing it to him, correctly summarizing his proposed date range of somewhere between 7,000–5,000 BCE or earlier, and then immediately follows that up by noting that mainstream Egyptologists attribute the same weathering to wind and sand erosion and continue to date the monument to roughly 2,500 BCE, consistent with Kafir. In other words, when you actually read what these AI systems say rather than the video titles built around them, what they're doing is accurately summarizing a real, decades-old scientific disagreement that most casual readers have simply never encountered before, not manufacturing a brand new discovery out of thin air. That distinction matters a lot, because it's easy to see why summarized this way, the answer feels stunning to someone hearing about the water erosion debate for the first time. It genuinely is a legitimate scientific controversy, argued by credentialed geologists in real academic venues, and it genuinely does raise the uncomfortable possibility that a monument as famous as the Sphinx might not be as precisely dated as popular science documentaries tend to imply. That's a real, honest surprise, and it doesn't need to be exaggerated into secret messages from a lost global civilization or fabricated confidence percentages to be interesting. The actual, sourced version of the story already has all the ingredients that make this kind of topic compelling. A credentialed scientist noticing something the mainstream initially dismissed, a genuine geological mechanism that could explain an anomaly other researchers hadn't fully accounted for, 3 decades of real back-and-forth argument in real journals, and a debate that, as of today, is still technically open, even if one side of it currently has the stronger supporting case. What AI systems like Grok are actually good at in a moment like this isn't discovering new evidence. Language models don't run laser scans of the Sphinx enclosure or conduct their own seismic surveys. What they can do is pull together published information from a wide range of sources, including papers most people would never think to search for on their own, papers by Schoch, by Gori, by Egyptologists responding to both of them, and present that information in a way that's more balanced and more complete than a lot of the pop science content circulating online, which tends to pick one side of this debate and ignore the other entirely. That's genuinely useful, and it's also a reasonable explanation for why some of these AI-generated summaries have caught people off guard. A viewer who only ever encountered the confident textbook version of the Sphinx's history, and then sees an AI system lay out a real, still unresolved counterargument backed by an actual geologist's actual published research, understandably feels like they've stumbled onto something being hidden from them. But nothing here has actually been hidden. Schoch's papers have been publicly available and openly debated since 1991. The rebuttals to his work are equally public. What's changed isn't the underlying science, it's that a tool now exists that can surface both sides of an academic argument to someone in seconds, without them needing to already know the names Schoch, Gorey, or West to go looking for it. It's also worth being honest about where the wilder versions of this story go wrong, because they tend to borrow the credibility of the real Schoch debate and then attach claims to it that have no actual scientific backing at all. Claims about a giant lion's head hidden beneath the current face, about hidden chambers precisely aligned with astronomical ages, about a buried global network of monuments encoding a warning from a civilization wiped out in a sudden catastrophe roughly 12,000 years ago. None of that comes from Schoch's actual published work, none of it comes from any peer-reviewed geological survey, and none of it reflects anything an AI model like Grok has actually stated when asked directly and specifically about the Sphinx. Those elaborate additions are speculative fiction dressed up in the language of AI analysis, built to sound authoritative by borrowing real scientific terms like erosion signatures and precession of the equinoxes and then attaching invented statistics and invented conclusions that no actual geologist or actual language model output supports. It's worth knowing the difference, not to spoil the fun of speculative storytelling, but because the real version of this story doesn't need any of that embellishment to be worth telling. A legitimate, unresolved scientific disagreement about the age of one of the most famous monuments on Earth is already a genuinely compelling piece of history on its own. So where does that leave the actual answer to the question in the title? If you ask who built the Sphinx, the honest answer, the one backed by the strongest body of evidence including quarry connections, construction technique, and the total absence of any earlier material culture at the site, still points to workers under Khafre's 4th dynasty reign around 2500 BCE, carving it as part of the same project that produced his pyramid and valley temple. That remains the position held by the vast majority of geologists and Egyptologists who have examined the physical evidence at Giza directly. But if you ask whether that answer has ever been seriously challenged by credentialed scientists using real geological methods, the honest answer is also yes. It has, repeatedly, for more than 30 years, by researchers who looked closely at the erosion patterns on that limestone and came away convinced they were looking at the fingerprints of ancient rainfall rather than desert wind. Both of those things can be true at once. The debate is real. The uncertainty is real. And the fact that an AI model can now lay both sides of that argument out clearly, accurately, and without picking a side just because one side is more popular, isn't proof of a hidden ancient secret finally being revealed. It's a demonstration of what happens when a genuinely interesting, decades-old scientific disagreement finally gets described honestly to an audience that, for the most part, had never been told it existed at all. The head restoration question deserves a bit more detail too, because it's genuinely documented across multiple periods of Egyptian history, not just speculated about once and left alone. Beyond the dream stele, archaeological surveys of the Sphinx have identified repair work using different limestone blocks and different masonry techniques layered onto the body at various points, consistent with restoration efforts carried out under later New Kingdom pharaohs, and further work is documented from the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, when the monument was already considered a genuine antiquity worth preserving rather than a recent construction. That layered restoration history is actually one of the more solid pieces of evidence for the Sphinx's age, just not in the way alternative theories usually frame it. It shows a monument that multiple entirely separate civilizations across thousands of years of Egyptian history all recognized as old, worth digging out of the sand, and worth repairing, which fits comfortably with a 4th dynasty origin already ancient by the time of the New Kingdom, without requiring any additional prehistoric chapter to explain why later Egyptians treated it with such reverence. That, in the end, might be the more interesting story than any invented one. Not a machine uncovering a secret the ancients tried to hide, but a tool finally doing something remarkably simple. Reading what scientists have actually published, on both sides of a real argument, and repeating it back accurately, without smoothing over the disagreement to make it sound tidier than it actually is. The Sphinx hasn't changed. The stone is exactly what it's always been, sitting in the desert, weathered in a pattern that 2 generations of geologists still can't fully agree on the cause of. What's changed is how easily that disagreement can now reach someone who never took a geology class or read a single academic paper on Giza's climate history, and that, more than any imagined message carved into stone, is probably the real reason this topic keeps resurfacing every time someone decides to ask an AI system the question directly. If you want to actually go look at the primary sources instead of taking any video's word for it, Robert Schoch's original 1991 Geological Society of America presentation and his later published papers are publicly available, as are Gori's 1995 rebuttal and the broader Egyptological literature responding to both. Reading them side by side is a far better way to understand what's actually known, actually contested, and actually still open, than any single dramatic retelling, including this one, could ever fully capture on its own.